All right, guys, today we're going to continue on with our discussion of cells by looking at the different stages that a typical normal cell goes through from the time that it's formed until the time that it actually divides into newer cells. And we call that set of stages the cell cycle. We mentioned that uh, cells were the basic units of structure and function in living things. That was one of the statements of our cell theory. Um, and we said that meant that cells were the smallest parts of living things that could still look and act and do the things that living things have to be able to do. And so if we think back to the first semester, we had a list of things that living things had to be able to do. And one of those things was to grow and develop, to go through a life cycle. And so as the basic units of living things, cells themselves go through a life cycle. And again, we call that the cell cycle. And so if we look at the cell cycle, what we're talking about is kind of the stages that almost all cells go through again during their life, during the time from when they're formed until when they divide into new cells. And that cell cycle has four basic stages. We've got them listed here. You may want to hold off just a second before you start writing those in, because we've got some details that'll go in there with them. But the four stages are the G1 stage, and then S, and then G2 and M. And those are, of course, abbreviations, and I'll explain to you what those abbreviations stand for. But that's all you have to remember. You won't have to actually remember what the abbreviations stand for. So yeah, G1, S, G2, and M. And so if we think of a new cell that's just been formed, um, we call that new cell, it's actually called a daughter cell, a cell that's just been formed. And so that daughter cell is going to start right here in the G1 phase of the cell cycle. And if we flip this box over here, during the G1 phase, the G actually stands for gap. So this is the first gap phase. That's G1. You see we also have G2 down here at the bottom. But during this gap phase, in between the M phase and the S phase, those are kind of the action phases of this cell cycle, when all the kind of the real stuff happens during M and S. And in between those two kind of action phases, we have these gap phases. And so the G in G1 stands for gap, but I remember it as grow and get ready, because that's what's going to happen to a cell during both of these G phases, both G1 and G2. The cell is going to grow and it's going to get ready for what's coming up next. And so in this case with G1, the cell is going to grow and it's going to get ready to replicate its DNA. Now by replicate, that word means to copy. So it's going to get ready to copy its DNA, to put together a new complete full copy of that DNA. Because in this cell cycle, what's going to basically happen is we're going to take one cell here, and it's going to go through the cell cycle, and then at the end of the cell cycle, that one cell is going to divide into two. And so in order for those two new cells to be fully functioning, healthy cells, they're going to need a full copy of the original cell's DNA. So in the growth phase, the G1 phase, the cell's going to grow, and it's going to get ready to copy that DNA. Right? So we move on from the G1 phase. Next up, you can see the arrow pointing. We come over here to the S phase, and so in G1 the cell grew and got ready to copy its DNA. So if you're thinking, you can probably predict what's going to happen in this S phase. During the S phase, the cell's going to copy its DNA. And so the S stands for synthesis. So this is the synthesis phase. That word synthesis means to put together. So the cell is going to put together a new copy of its DNA. It's going to take the original copy of the DNA that was found in the first cell and make a second copy of it. All right, so we got G1, and then we follow that up with S. It grows and gets ready to copy its DNA. Then it copies the DNA in the S phase. Then we're going to go to the G2 phase, which is the second gap phase. And again, just like in G1, the cell is going to grow and get ready for what's coming next. And in this case, in the second gap phase, it's growing and getting ready for cell division. Right? So again, if you're thinking ahead, you can probably predict what's coming over here in the M phase. We're growing and getting ready for cell division here, so that means cell division is going to happen over here. Normally that cell division is going to happen by mitosis. Not always, but most of the time. And so the M phase generally stands for mitosis. Right? So that's kind of the complete cell cycle. Again, the action phases are here in the S phase and the M phase. That's when the important stuff is happening. Copying the DNA, dividing into two new cells. Copying the DNA, dividing into two new cells. And then in between those action phases, we have these growth phases, these gaps where the cell is getting prepared for those action phases. All right. So there's the kind of the general cell cycle. Let's take just a minute or two to think about what that's actually gonna look like within a cell. So if you'll flip over to the other side of your notes, we're going to draw some pictures that kind of shows where kind of shows how this process happens. And we're going to draw a very basic simple cell here. So if you'll notice, I've got a little oval drawn there representing the cell. Inside that oval, I've just drawn a little squiggly line. That's going to represent its DNA. So if we start with a brand new little baby cell that's just been formed, it's got one copy of its DNA. And again, this is a very simplified version of what the cell is going to actually look like, of course. But we'll be able to get the idea of what's going on with the cell cycle from this. So if we start with that one cell with one copy of its DNA, the first stage that it's going to go through is going to be the G1 phase. So if you'll take from where you've drawn that first cell there and just draw you a little arrow that goes about a quarter of a turn around, again, we're drawing what's happening at each of these stages of the cell cycle. And so we got G1 and then S and G2 and M, so you're going to end up with kind of four sets of drawings here. If we were to think of like a clock face, this one's going to be at 12 o'clock, and then over here at 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and then 9 o'clock for our third drawing. And then we'll be back to 12 by the time we end up. So just to kind of help you figure out what your drawings are going to look like, you're going to end up with four sets of drawings kind of in a circle here. That's where the cycle part comes in. So, but anyway, the first arrow, again, is going to go about a quarter of the way around. And that arrow there is going to represent this G1 process. So if we think about what we said happened during the G1 stage, that cell is going to grow and get ready. So at the end of the G1 phase here, if we were to draw a picture of what that cell looks like now, it's still going to have the one copy of its DNA, just like it had to start with, but it has grown. And so our second picture here, we got a bigger cell, still one copy of the DNA, but we have increased in size. Right? So the cell is going to get bigger and get ready to copy the DNA, but it hasn't copied it yet. That's going to happen in the next phase that comes along, which of course we learned on the other side was the S phase of the cell cycle. So again, we got G1 here. Our cell has grown and gotten bigger, and then we're going to go through the S phase. In the S phase, the S again stood for synthesis, which means to put together. It's going to put together a new copy of its DNA. So when we draw our picture here for the S phase, I may have to scroll down here a little bit to where you can see everything. And when we get to the S phase, it's going to be still about the same size as it was at the end of G1, but now instead of one little squiggly line representing the DNA, now we've drawn in two squiggly lines because it's made an exact copy of that DNA. And so after the S phase is over, the cell is going to have two complete copies of its DNA. By the way, on your notes, make sure that you do draw in the pictures like I have here, but also make sure that you fill in the descriptions as well. So we went through G1 and S. So the next phase would be the G2 phase of the cell cycle. Again, kind of a resting phase, a time for the cell to kind of grow and develop and get ready for what's coming up next. And so at the end of G2, if we were to draw a picture of that, the cell is going to be, again, bigger again. And so it's increased in size even more. And again, that growth is important. Over here in the G1 phase, the cell has to grow big enough to be able to have room for both these sets of DNA. That DNA takes up some space. And so the cell needs to be big enough to grow, to handle that two copies of the DNA. In the G2 phase, it's going to grow and get ready to divide. So at the end of G2, that cell has to be big enough to where it can split into two new cells, and both of those new cells be able to survive. So it's very, very important that cell grows big enough during that G2 phase. And it's not going to go into the last phase, the M phase, until that cell recognizes that, hey, it's big enough to be able to split into two, and both of those new cells be good, viable, healthy cells. All right? So we went through G1. The cell grew and got bigger and got ready to copy its DNA, got the machinery together that it needs to copy its DNA. Then during the S phase, it's actually going to copy its DNA. The G2 phase is going to grow some more and get ready for cell division. Again, put the kind of the parts in place that it needs to go through that cell division process. And so then we're going to finish up with the M phase, which is going to kind of take us back here to the beginning. But at the end of the M phase, we're not going to have one cell. That one cell that we had here at the end of G2 is going to split into two. And so we're going to end up with two new cells, exact copies of each other. After the M phase, each of those new cells then is going to go back through this cell cycle again. So at the end of the M phase, we have two new healthy cells, and each of those new healthy cells is going to enter into the cell cycle here at the G1 phase, and it's going to start growing and getting ready for cell division. That's kind of the life cycle of a cell. It starts out as one cell, grows and gets bigger in the G1 phase, gets ready to copy its DNA, goes through the S phase and copies its DNA, then into the G2 phase, where it grows and gets ready to divide, and then cell division through mitosis in the M phase, and we end up with two cells, again, exactly like the first one that we had. Now, a couple of questions that pop up here at this point most of the time. Some students will ask, how long does this process take? And that's a good question, but it's a question that's impossible to answer because it depends on what type of cell we're looking at. Some bacteria cells are able to go through this entire cell cycle in as little as 30 minutes to an hour. So they'll whip through G1S, G2, and M very, very quickly. They go through the division process very quickly. Other cells, like maybe skin cells or the cells that line your stomach or intestines, are going through this cell cycle, every couple of days or so. Other cells, like cells in your liver, kidneys, places like that, they may go through this cell cycle every few months. And then there are other cells, like brain cells, that'll go through this cell cycle once during your entire lifetime. So it really depends on the type of cell that we're talking about as to how long it takes for this process to happen. And so that's one question that pops up. The second question that pops up is requires a little bit more of an explanation. So let's go to a fresh slide here. And that question that pops up sometimes is, okay, when does a cell do whatever job it's supposed to be? So if a cell is just constantly going through this cell cycle, growing and getting ready, copying the DNA, growing and getting ready again, dividing into two, when does it actually do whatever function it's supposed to do? So when does a brain cell get to be a brain cell? When does a liver cell get to do the job of that liver cell? When does it do what it's supposed to do? And that actually happens not in the normal course of this cell cycle, but in another phase, a fifth phase of this cell cycle that we call G0. And so if you want to add in, it usually occurs sometime here, definitely before S, before the cell makes a second copy of its DNA. Some cells will break off into this little offshoot from the normal cell cycle, and they'll go into this sort of holding phase here, this G0 phase, where they do whatever job it is they're supposed to do, they're designed to do. And again, this G0 phase is part of what determines how quickly the cells go through it. Again, some cells like your skin cells, the cells lining the inside of your mouth or something like that, they're going to go into G0 for just a little while and then come back out of it after a couple of days maybe, and go on through the rest of the cell cycle rather quickly. Again, other cells like brain cells will go into this G0 phase and stay there permanently, never come back out again. That's one of the reasons why brain injuries are so drastic, or so serious, because you guys have I'm sure cut your skin before, and those skin cells around that cut, that cut signals those cells to come out of G0 and start dividing and start going into the cell cycle, and can they kind of heal that cut back up. But brain cells don't do that. They go into the cell cycle, they go into G0, and they stay there. And we've yet to find any way to trigger them to come back out of G0 and start dividing again. So when brain cells become injured and damaged or die, they don't get replaced. So it's very, very important that we take care of those brain cells that we have. The ones that you have now are the ones that you'll always have, because they go into this G0 phase and they stay there permanently. All right. So that kind of wraps up our discussion of the cell cycle. I think I've got one more little diagram here that kind of shows the same thing that we've been talking about. Again, a new cell would start here, go through that first growth phase, go through kind of normal processes, then go into the DNA replication, the synthesis phase, and after that, back into the second growth phase, G2, and then into the cell division phase, mitosis. And if you'll notice on this little diagram, mitosis is broken down into some different parts, and that's where the next section of notes will take us. We'll take a closer look at each of these four stages of mitosis, and also this process here at the end of mitosis that actually divides the cell from one into two. All right. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or post them on the Edmodo site. I'll be glad to clear those questions up for you if I can. See you guys.